I want to talk about what is Agile Architecture, how can we work with architecture in an Agile setting. So I'm very happy that you'll have me, and I know that a lot of you guys are as experienced as I am as architects and trying to make Agile teams work. So I'd very much like for this to be an interactive session. We have this speaker cube. Is it ready, Christopher?
Yeah. No. There.
Right. Does it work? Yep. So, if anyone wants to comment or ask a question or disagrees, raise a hand, and by using the cube, we're able to get the sound into the live stream of the feed. So I know that with different experiences comes different opinions, and there's no black and white solutions to any of this. So this is based on the experience I've had working with Agile and trying to make things work, and some of the best practices I've learned along the way. Let's see. Okay, so the introduction, or the introduction to this meetup was: have you ever wondered how to work efficiently with enterprise and software architecture in an Agile setting? And a robust framework for working with software architecture and coordinating best practices between Agile teams is an important key to avoid micromanagement and be able to build autonomous development teams in a network organization that let companies scale much more efficiently. So, how many here are skeptical to the very idea that having autonomous teams are beneficial to an organization? Okay, so everyone is enthusiastically positive. That is awesome. It does not come without challenges. Yeah. So the key assumption I have is that actually being able to build autonomous Agile teams is hugely beneficial to the scalability of an organization. By being able to delegate both responsibility, like real responsibility and mandate, and to build competent development teams, being able to take full responsibility of creating the technology architecture, the solutions architecture, the application architecture of a part of the solution is hugely beneficial. But then, of course, governance is key. This does not happen by itself. So the first thing I'll talk about is how important it is to establish architecture governance to make these autonomous, self-driven development teams work, and some experience on how that can be done. So part of what is really important is to create a shared purpose and an understanding of a common direction. So this is a simplified illustration of an engineering organization with 4 product areas. And it's taken from my time being technology head of the development organization at NRK, where we had 4 or even 5 distinct product areas, ranging from TV and radio streaming apps to websites and other solutions, to NRK Super or the kids program, youth application and services, and everything that came together. So these were really distinct product areas with strong product managers and product owners, but without a central governance or coordination of the technology architecture beneath. though they would diverge and start pulling in different direction and not have the benefit of actually building a shared logical infrastructure, not focusing on a clean API-driven architecture and shared components and so on. And this was an ongoing struggle. Different teams implementing different integrations to the backend services, and having bottlenecks waiting for another part of the organization to be able to deliver what they needed, because there was no there wasn't established a shared governance across the teams. So this illustration tries to depict 4 distinct product areas with multiple development teams beneath each. And without a shared governance, you can see that it's possible to keep cohesion within each product area. But without establishing some kind of body outside this, they would diverge and unable to align their efforts. So this is another what's the word for that? Påstand. Claim, yes. So this is another claim, is that to make this work, working with people and having people collaborating and working together is much more important than formal procedures, architecture models, or a strict enterprise architecture regime. So this is back to the Agile Manifesto, valuing people and interactions over processes and tools. So getting people together, getting people together is hugely important to make this work. So what we wanted to do is we wanted to establish an organization with architecture responsibility on each team. And the colors here depict different competency area within the cross-functional teams, within the cross-functional team. In this, the purple color depicts DevOps or operations engineers. Then you have back-end and mobile engineers, then front-end engineers, and then UX at the top with a tech lead or tech lead / architect on top. The only reason why there is no tech lead hat, the triangle on the UX or interaction design layer, is by accident. One of the core principles I've used when establishing this is that the architecture capacity is most usually found within the development competences within the team, but that is not always true. And it's one of my opinions is that it's very important to build on the existing strengths within the team. Sometimes that architecture capacity can come from an interaction design lead. Other times it might be a DevOps resource. It can be people who also function as in other roles on the cross-functional teams. In large organization, it starts to become beneficial to have dedicated architects working across multiple teams and start organizing, facilitating this across teams. Here you see a model with a technology leader group with different competency leads coordinating together. So here you have a CTO, and then you have a front-end development lead, a back-end development lead, a native app development lead, and so on and so forth, working together to establish a governance body coordinating between the teams. So the next step in governance is to start meeting regularly and start working together to share ideas, share knowledge, share common practice, to establish governance. And this needs to be anchored, if you like, in the leader group or in the leadership in the company, so that this group needs to have real mandate. This need to be supported. And one of my big challenges when I had the role of CTO would be to fight this fight in the leader group and have them understand that it does not work to have a command and control organization where you dictate down what the team should do. You need to delegate both responsibility and power to actually work together and define the architecture, but also to build up the competency of actually taking that responsibility. Any people here who are not Norwegian speakers at all? Okay, so a couple. So I'll try to keep the Norwegian terms to an absolute minimum and then try to translate them back to English whenever. But in Norwegian we talk about ansvarskompetanse, the competency of actually taking responsibility. And to make this work, this model with autonomous teams, you really need, I'll go back, you really need to build this real competency of taking responsibility. Because sometimes the teams themselves will get the responsibility of implementing a component that is a crucial part of an API-driven architecture, a microservice or modular architecture, where other teams are dependent on it, and they themselves need to understand the importance of flagging the need to coordinate between teams, and also the importance of listening and understanding both end user needs and other developer needs in the organization to actually fulfill this responsibility. So this is very much people's work, coordinating and convincing people and having professional training. It does not come by itself overnight, but you have to build on the competencies and the talents you have in the organization to begin with. So at the higher level, what is the point of architecture? Some people I've talked to talk about it in a way that it's important to document the systems for its own purpose, like documentation has its own value. So I only agree if the purpose of documentation is to make it more efficient for the teams and the organization to actually work with the systems that you are creating. Just creating formal documentation, formal notation in Archimate or UML or whatever has no value unless that translates into increased efficiency somewhere else in the organization. Just documenting, and that's my claim, just documenting has not any purpose unless it helps another part of the organization solve their jobs or tasks more efficiently. And you should be able to answer that question, who benefits for having this documentation? But if you are dumped out of an airplane in unknown territory and you land in the middle of the jungle, it is really helpful to have a map navigating out of that jungle. And for people working as consultants or taking over a huge project with a lot of technical debt, starting to figure out how that system works or starting to work efficiently with that system is very much like being dropped in the middle of the jungle. There's a quagmire there, you don't know where it is, but if you step too far in that direction, you're stuck in the quagmire. In other direction, there's poisonous snakes, or you can stumble down a ravine. You really need to understand, or having a map helping you navigate unknown territory efficiently is hugely beneficial to the team. Also, when several teams want to coordinate between themselves, having an understanding of where the other components are and how they fit into the bigger picture is hugely helpful. And it's really necessary, it's a fundamental thing you need for one team to be able to understand and work efficiently with the work another team or a bunch of other teams a team produces. And you need to sit together and draw this map, sharing responsibility. Where does the borders and boundaries go? What should the interfaces be between the components? Here, domain-driven design comes into play as a very, very important methodology, in my opinion. This talk is unfortunately not about that, more about different things in a bigger picture. How many here know DDD or domain-driven design already? Awesome. And the rest of you should look it up and just start with the Wikipedia synopsis and read some articles about it. Establishing clear bounding context between different modules, understanding the need of having clear and well-defined APIs between different modules are key to build those autonomous teams and releasing some of the potential on the teams. So the next thing I want to talk a little bit about is Conways Law. And this is kind of like a fashion thing, hipster developer thing the last couple of years. Everyone has been talking about Conways Law. But I think there's something very valuable to learn from this. And from this insight that organizations are bound to copy the organizational structure or the communication structures of the organizations they are. So if you have a really messy organization with unclear and messy communication structure or mandate or so on, you're going to have messy software systems. So anyway, yeah. So so part of the way to address this, right, and what you can do when you have when you realize that Conways Law is in some way relevant, is to try to do an inverse Conway maneuver. How many here know this term already? How many here have tried to establish or try to pull off an inverse Conway maneuver? Exactly. So this is not easy. It's really, really hard. And do you work in private or public sector?
I'm a consultant.
Yeah, exactly. So you come into to a big company or some big governmental organization or whatever, and you try to talk about this, and everyone are positive to begin with, but then they start to realize, okay, there's some consequences here. There's actually some real consequence to the way we organize and fund different part of the organization, and then resistance starts to happening. Because another thing you need to do here to pull this off is to do what I talked about earlier, to actually really empower the development teams and the architects and the tech leads you have to have responsibility to make decisions and then coordinate upwards. There's still a need for technology leadership, but that role is much more facilitating and coordinating discussions and making sure that we make decisions, this is direction, and overseeing that we actually follow the plan we agreed to in quick iterations, rather than creating a plan together with leader group, then dictating it down in the organization. And this is a huge shift for most organizations to deal with. It's very difficult. I've partly succeeded once with you guys. Other than that, it's a difficult thing. But this is part of the solution. To realize if you want to build clear-cut systems with good boundaries and well-defined APIs between the modules. You should also build an engineering organization with well-defined teams, clear-cut communication between the different modules, well-defined way of organizing and making decisions and sharing knowledge and so on. And the more of this you have in place in the organization, my claim is that the easier it will be to actually build well-crafted, well-engineered systems. An organization with a good architecture is much better suited to create software with a well-defined and good architecture. So another big goal of working efficiently with architecture and investing time in doing architecture work. And I know this is really obvious to you guys who work as architects, but in a lot of organization and with maybe naive and a bit inexperienced developers or engineering managers, actually building the case that yes, it's really necessary to invest in actually working on your architecture. It's not given. Like, yes, we really need to spend time on architecture. And this is to reduce complexity. So another claim is that Agile Architecture is one of the main goals, is about reducing the complexity of the systems you create. The lower the complexity, the easier the maintainability, and the easier it is for developers and others to understand how the system is built and how to integrate the different parts together. So I'm going to switch quickly to another presentation because I didn't have time to add it to this one. Let's see. Oh, it's on the wrong screen. And then I go something like this. Yep. This also work? Ho ho. Awesome. So these two graphs are actually the same graphs. And this is an illustration of this graph with direct integration between all nodes in the system. And this can be objects in a big object-oriented or class hierarchy, big system, or it can be integrations between separate modules or microservices in a microservice-based system. The point is that the more nodes you get, the higher the complexity of maintaining this becomes. And as you can see from this illustration, it is impossible to understand or see which nodes are connected to which. So if there's if one of the nodes break, then the whole system will go down. So one of the key things to try to achieve here is to reduce the complexity. And the way complexity works is called Metcalfes Law. And he developed it actually to calculate or say something about the value of a mass communication system, of a telephone system. And he said that the value of a telephone system increases exponentially with the number of users. So when only a couple of people uses the system, it has very low value. But when almost everyone uses a telephone system, it has an immense value. But the same law is valid for complexity as well. Complexity within a system increases proportional with the number of nodes that are interconnected. So one of the patterns you can use to achieve this is to establish a central node. And by establishing a central node, you get a linear growth in complexity. And this is a pattern that has been, people have tried to implement them in software systems for decades. It is the core idea between the enterprise service bus, which is a lot of people hate, but actually has very good merits exactly for reducing the complexity of a system. Of course, what happened is that the bus itself becomes inherently complex, because that's where all the controllers actually implementing the logic to integrate with all these different systems lies, so that itself becomes the bottleneck and the huge problem for efficiently adding functionality to a system. So today we're in a different iteration when it comes to this, where we are talking about API gateways. So the world has standardized more or less on HTTPS and JSON as a communication protocol for web services and integration between cloud-based services. And very often you route this through an API gateway so that you can handle stuff like authorization and authentication, and maybe also SSL termination in a common place, reducing the complexity of or the need to implement functionality in your microservices. This is good as long as you're able to delegate a lot of the responsibility of providing a well-structured data format to the end service. So the difference between an API gateway and an enterprise service bus, fundamentally, in my opinion, is that the enterprise service bus is actually responsible for implementing the logic of tying the services together. So with an ESB pattern, you'll have a database saying, I'm just a stupid database, you can talk ODBC and make SQL queries to me, but the rest is up to you. And similar with a SOAP service or a Corba service or something similar. Hey, I only talk SOAP, you can integrate with me, but the rest is up to you. With RESTful or REST-like APIs, where you have HTTP and JSON, it's much easier to create a clear-cut contract where you say, okay, so, or I am service something, let's say Facebook or Twitter. I provide this API, you can query my API the way you want, and you get this JSON. And then the responsibility is with the providing service. And when you have a lot of third-party web services from big providers like Google, Twitter, Facebook, and others, it's much easier to understand and maintain. And one of the practices I encourage is to require the same level of design by contract or contract-driven development as you expect from a third-party service. So when you have an internal module responsible for creating a RESTful API to the services, that should be well defined. It should have documentation. It does not need to be fancy, even though very good tools like Swagger and others are available for free to embed and use in your system. But it could be as simple as a Confluence page or something like that, documenting the API and namespace you have for the API's properly. But delegating that responsibility to the end nodules, not collecting everything in the middle, is one of the ways of reducing that complexity in a good way. Let's see. Yeah. And the goal of this is to have a system where complexity is vastly reduced, where you have clean-cut interfaces and well-defined contracts between the nodes. The interconnection between modules and nodes are kept under control, and where it's much easier to trace the interconnectivity of your system. Feel free to disagree, by the way. So, this is from a talk I've done several times through the last 3 or 4 years. Because this then is the benefit of what could be called API-first development or API-driven development. The reason why this is important for agile architecture or succeeding having a large scalable organization with multiple autonomous teams and product areas work is because the successful implementation of a distributed architecture is so fundamental to succeeding with this. So, for those of you who know how a car engine works, the API then functions like the differential. So differential is the gear-like thing in the middle of or in the axle of the car that allows the different wheels to move independent of each other and consume only the necessary force of the engine's torque. And this allows us to implement much more decoupled and flexible and extensible interfaces. By first, of course, be user-driven. First focus on what functionality the user needs, using design thinking or Google design sprints. The next question should be okay, let's start talking about which APIs we need to define to actually provide this user interface, to provide this functionality. Of course, this will go on pretty much concurrently. You'll talk about the components, what we need, what we have, what we need to build, but the focus should be on the APIs. Before you start finalizing the mobile interface or deciding just how the user interface should be, or before you get hung up in the limitations of the existing backend systems or database systems or stuff like that, you should talk about what kind of APIs do we need to tie it all together. And when you have that API engine, first of all, you have decoupled the potential of implementing the functionality you need from the limitations of your existing backend. Of course, you need to implement the controllers and the parts that you're missing. But the user interface is not inherently hard-glued or hard-welded to your backend systems anymore. You're free to innovate. And you can say, oh yeah, we need to add these components, providing these APIs to provide or create the possibility of this functionality. But you have uncoupled the hard dependency of a legacy backend system. And by being strictly API driven, it is much easier to create good flexible interfaces for different devices much more efficiently. When everyone relies on the same APIs in the backend, it's much easier to implement really nice mobile interfaces within weeks, tablet interfaces, desktop interfaces, interfaces for big screen, and whatever device you need. And if there's one thing we know, is that every couple of years new devices come. Now it's home assistants you can talk to, like Alexa or Siri or Google Home. It is chatbots. It is AI or machine learning driven interfaces that require APIs to integrate with to get data streams out. It's all of these benefits, and also having this clear-cut API strategy is crucial to actually build that real autonomy, is that right? To build that autonomy in your teams. How long have I been talking?
An hour, I think.
Yeah. Should we take 10 minutes break and then I can continue with the second part?
Hello. So just a thought. The thing that you presented sounds awesome, and I would love to work in that organization that you just laid out. But many organizations I've been working with, it doesn't look like that. It isn't API first. It isn't this clear architecture or clear organizational architecture. So why are we not why is the world different? That's my question. In many places.
Yep. I don't know. Do any of you guys have ideas? Why are these, or do is what I'm talking about recognizable to you guys? So, any ideas of like why are these things hard to get in place in the organizations?
Politics. Like different stakeholders have their own interests closest to heart, I guess.
Yep. Or you can keep it and then just throw it to someone else. Sorry, Marco. Yeah, of course it's politics. That's part of it. And I don't have the solution to how to solve of that, of course. It's a struggle. Another thing I worked or am continuously trying to solve is the challenge of how to build that sense of responsibility. Because in many organizations it feels safe to sit and say, oh, somebody should do, but not take responsibility for actually being part of the solution. So how do you build that safety or that sense of safety, if you like? Everyone talks about being allowed to fail and the importance of failing, but how do you build that kind of organization where we're trying our stuff out and not getting reprimanded for it is possible?
Well, I'm not sitting up there when I see the whole. Oops. Yes, this is cute. Typically, I'm not up there looking at the whole organization. You're somewhere in the middle of the jungle, and you want to build your safe oasis. Like this is the project which we're working on, and we wanted to have it good, and we want to kind of get the situation under control. And maybe the 5 steps here is what you can do for your project within an organization of Jungle. I'm very curious to know how to proceed there, because it's sometimes quite frustrating.
Yeah. So the next part is, you can just keep it and then give it to whoever. So the next part is about a little bit about how you can build that organization that starts working with architecture in the small and build piece by piece the experience and knowledge to actually do this really well. Because I've gone through those steps myself, just starting out as a developer, just hacking away on my web app, my website, yeah, and then slowly understanding the need to organize and build architecture and thinking through the solution. And this is 5 steps where you can start really small and work towards making this work. So when you start out with a team or a group of team, and remember, you have to start small. It's just establish the practice of discussing a solution on the whiteboard. A lot of teams don't do this. You might use Scrum, you might have sprint planning, you might try to invite the stakeholders in and discuss the backlog and agree, and then you prioritize and maybe you do planning poker, but you don't stop and just think the solution through. Draw it on the whiteboard. What are the components of the solution? How does it tie together? You go back in and the individual developer starts implementing user stories without a clear understanding of the bigger picture and the plan. So if that's the case, and this has been the case for many projects I worked on, is to just understand that you need to stop and think, we need to have a plan. It does not need to be the big waterfall plan, but it needs to be the stop, we're just starting a new module, a new component, a new functionality, and we don't know how this fits into the bigger picture. We need to stop and draw the lines and see how this fits into the rest of the stuff we're building. So you start to have this 5 minutes, 20 minutes brainstorming on the whiteboard, where you draw boxes and arrows and you wipe it out and start over, and you discuss how does this solution fit into the bigger picture? How is it going to talk to the database? What kind of database does it need? Does it need new data? Should that be migrated or built into the existing database, or should you have a separate database? What kind of APIs do you need on top of that? How does that fit into the application framework, and how you make the rest of the stuff fit together? Take time to discuss all those things, and actually really, really important, take pictures of the whiteboard and store them. So the second part of the challenge then is to make this information that you're starting to build, make it easy to find again and to keep as a reference. So actually giving the pictures and images and documents descriptive names is really, really important, because you have to be able to pick them back up and use them for reference. So the threshold for this can be really, really low to begin with. It's just start doing this, just start building the understanding on your team or teams that this is important, and build step by step what you need to do. So start organizing the images in a share folder, or start using a wiki or like Confluence. How many here are not using Confluence at all? What kind of documentation system are you using? I didn't hear it.
Something called Track.
Track? Is it good?
No.
But the important thing is not what kind of system you use. It can be Google Drive, it can be shared folders, it can be Track, it can be an historical Trello board, or something similar. The important thing is to organize things and store them. And then slowly but surely working on keeping that folder up to date. So that when you revise an architecture or solution as you build it, you update the pictures or documentations or illustrations with what you're actually building. Yeah.
I sometimes find it difficult to get buy-in from the customer or from the project manager to actually take the time to keep documentation up to date, to keep it organized as the project develops.
Yep.
How do we solve that?
I have several answers to that. Some are silly and like not serious, and others are serious. Don't always tell the manager is something not. It's partly silly, but also a bit serious. It's part of focus on the end user functionality when you define tasks in the backlog, and don't go into detail into technical requirements to what you need to solve it, because as soon as you separate, actually create the functionality, create unit test and integration test to test that it works, is separate into different tasks, then a non-technical project manager or manager can come in and say, oh no, we're really tight on time, skip the testing, just do the functionality, right? And they will say the same thing to documentation. No, this can't be necessary, we don't need those fancy drawings. Why you're sitting here in this room talking about this instead of just sitting at your desk coding? I've experienced that. I've had the managing director of the company I worked in come in and yelling at us because we were having an architecture panel planning session and not implementing stuff. And it's not easy to create the safety that it's okay to spend time on doing that. So yes, this is a struggle, and sometimes you need to take that discussion to your manager, explain why this is important as pedagogically and polite as you can. But sometimes it is necessary to get forgiveness in retrospect. It's often easier to get forgiveness than get allowance, right? It's a Norwegian saying that. Permission, yeah. Det lettere å få tilgivelse enn tillatelse. And this is true.
You could also get it into the definition of done.
Awesome answer. I agree completely. And working on that and that is really good both for the team to agree on what they should actually do, to what is the definition of done. It is actually having tests, and it is having a stub documentation with the architecture and solution and in the place that you agree to have it. Is a really good way. But the last important thing on this slide, though, is that when you start building this best practice, this is part of an architecture repository. And that is a really important asset to build as you to gain like what company maturity or corporation maturity levels, like being able to continuously learn in an organization is really important. To be able to replicate or repeat processes in a predictable way is really important. And to establish patterns of best practice and building blocks to how to build solutions and parts of the system is a really important capability to have. So the fact that you're starting to collect solutions across teams, the fact that you're starting to be able to use it as documentation, but also as part of a toolbox to pick out later on, also how we're going to build a new API service module. How are we going to build it? Let's see what the other teams have built. Oh, what they did on the other team was really cool. They used this pattern and built it this way. Let's do it the same way they did. And then you're starting to learn from each other, and you're starting to build more robust software in a cohesive way. So the third step is that when the different teams have started and getting used to the practice of actually documenting their architecture and how they plan their solutions and how it fits, then start having architecture show and tells. Have weekly 1 hour or 2 hour meetings where part is part is lightning talks, where one or two teams have 15 to 30-minute presentations of the state of their team and their development and what they're doing, with peer review and discussion and criticism from the other teams. And then as a CTO, chief architect, or architecture lead, then it's your responsibility to facilitate discussions and alignments and agreements across the teams. So part of the meeting is technical. The different teams present for each other what they're doing and how they're working. The other part of the meeting is a meeting you facilitate where you agree on best practices, how to align this across teams, which team should build a shared functionality all the teams needed. So all the teams need login and authentication functionality. We need a module that lets us authenticate with OAuth and integrate with our LDAP or AD or just user database and provide that to the other team. So which team should take that responsibility? And you have these discussions of aligning the overarching architecture. So this is a crucial group to start establishing the architecture governance within the organization. This can start really informal, really lightweight. It's just fun having the teams discuss their solutions and our architecture with each other. You have pizza and beer, and you have you start building a strong professional community, and then you build the understanding and the maturity to actually have proper governance and proper alignment out of that practice. So when you've started using this and the teams have gotten used to presenting the architecture to each other and discussing it, it's a good time to start introducing better and more expressive diagramming techniques. Sometimes this goes works out by itself, that you'll have enthusiasts that start use Lucidchart or start using other VCO or other diagramming tools, and you'll see that very quickly the teams will stop drawing on whiteboards and actually start preparing proper presentations of their architecture. But it's really important to allow for practice and a low threshold for contributing. But one of the goals I try to aim for in this phase is to have this expectation that each team that presents should try to do it a little better than the previous teams the team that present. And in a previous job, we agreed to the aim that one of the goals of doing the architecture presentations were also that at any point of time, any manager or executive, and this was a British-American company, so at any point in time, an executive should be able to come up to us and ask us for a presentation, and we should have a top-notch presentation ready. We should always be able to give the 10 or 15-minute pitch on what we were doing, what the point of our architecture was, and how that fit into the bigger picture. This is also a very good jumping board to build a professional community in your company that are able and willing to go out and do presentations at meetups and conferences, and build the confidence of doing this internally. By practicing doing lightning talks and presentations for each other, it becomes easier and easier to be part of that professional community that goes out and shares knowledge, and that helps your company build a name for itself. And that makes it also easier and easier to attract better candidates for recruitment, because then you become attractive in other people's eyes. And it's very, very easy to build that understanding and that enthusiasm within the engineering group. There's, in my experience, there's always a couple of people who grab this opportunity and start doing really good presentations. And if you get that positive effect going, then you can build a really good positive engineering culture out of these practices. So the effect is, or the goal is, not only to build this architecture group with a big important job function to do, but it's also to build this fun, competency-driven organization where people actually are having a good time while doing it. So the last step is just to continue practicing this. I'm really fond of C4 myself, as many of you are, I'm sure. I very often use C4 to build the context diagrams to show what is the context of the system or component we're building, how does it fit into the whole, and then I break that into component diagrams, and then I can break that into UML, which is also very useful with use case diagrams and sequence diagrams and so on and so forth. A lot of these diagrams are really beneficial to know when you get used to them, and all developers, all engineers would benefit from learning just both how to model them, create them, and read them properly. So practicing this in the architecture group, being fluent in at least C4 and UML is a really good investment.
So long time since I worked with UML. What tools would you recommend?
Any tool. I like Draw.io because it's online and it has a really expressive set of templates. How many here know Draw.io? Exactly. And then, but Lucidchart, Draw.io, some of the online tools, because like the disruptive capabilities of having online shared diagrams, real simple collaborative workflows where different people can work on the diagram at the same time, outweighs the lack of more advanced features. And yeah.
I believe it's something tools that in conference.
Yeah.
Coming.
You can use
Already. Yeah.
Please. Guy behind there. Please.
All right. So yeah. No, I agree. And my key, or my strongest opinion about this is that the tools you use should not be that important. If anything, I would recommend against using like an enterprise architecture toolkit, like Enterprise Architect from Sparks, or something that is really tied in with Archimate or something like that. Those techniques and those notations can be really, really good to use in an organization that is mature with enterprise architecture, and you have a strong enterprise architect group that work with that. but the benefits you get does not outweigh the cost of that added complexity if anyone has worked with them. So just like all the extra stuff you need to add to your models and to work with them, it's like I would not start or introduce enterprise architecture tools until it's like really necessary or required from your organization. VCO is really good, Draw.io is really good, Lucidchart, Glyphy, and then all PowerPoint is just using PowerPoint is also good. And then there's a whole bunch of tools that I don't know, which are tailored towards UML or BPMN that people might have really positive experiences with. But yeah, keep it as simple as possible for as long as possible.
Any experience with RDoc?
No, not directly. I've had presentations, or RDoc has presented to people or to my engineer organization. We've considered RDoc. I think, how many here know RDoc? Yeah. So RDoc is a Norwegian startup working on automatically generating as complete diagrams and illustrations that you can from source code or from like raw or not necessarily source code files per se, but from documentation. You might know that, might know RDoc much better than I.
Well, just had it demoed myself. So
yeah, yeah. So it looks like a very interesting tool for people who want that or need that. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
how do you spell it?
ARDOQ.
Oh, with a Q at the end.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And one last note on diagramming. I would stay away from bothering with class diagrams or actually modeling your actual code, because that's the layer where my personal opinion is that that's where your source code should be as self-documenting as possible. So keep it at the component and context layer.
Let's assume that we want to get the concepts first.
Yep.
And if they're many to many, like ER, very high level ER.
Yep.
Not the database, the concepts.
Yep.
I think then UML diagrams without any methods or any, maybe they are primary key or business key and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Only.
Yeah.
I think that's clustergram are useful for that.
I agree. And I very often use just boxes with arrows, descriptive text, and pretty colors. I find that pretty colors are really important.
What's your favorite color?
Actually, it's like a palette like this, maybe. So, yeah. Pastels broken into earth tones.
But tip, you make a legend so everybody understands what you mean by your colors.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, and another thing I try to use is I try to use colors consistently, so the same color means the same thing. And then in enterprise architecture and TOGAF, or in Archimate, you have color symbols like yellow is for the business layer, blue is for the application layer, green is for the technology layer, and so on. And it's beneficial if you are fluent in that, then it helps to introduce concepts like that consistently, and then build the maturity as you go, right? So then suddenly a year later, people say, "Oh, this is actually consistent with like the Archimate model. Did you know this?" And you can say, "I didn't know that. Oh, that's pretty cool." Yeah. So I've already talked about governance, but so how many here work with TOGAF from day to day? Yeah, but how many here have worked with TOGAF, know pretty well what it is? Yeah, so quite a few, but not all. So TOGAF it stands for the Open Group Architecture Framework. It is the enterprise architecture framework people talk about, collected and blessed into a formal standard by the Open Group. And it presents itself as a practice of, or best practices of enterprise architects. And with tools and handbook on how to implement enterprise architecture in a proper way. I lump it together with things like PMI, which is for project management, similar to Prince2 if you know that, and ETIL, where there's a ton of stuff that you can learn from TOGAF with best practices, like with ETIL, learning about release management, change management, so on and so forth is hugely beneficial to implement a proper DevOps organization. But you don't want to implement ETIL in a DevOps organization. The same thing with TOGAF. There's a ton of things to learn from TOGAF and things you need to do and or make sure you have in place, like a proper architecture vision, that you have a proper business technology alignment and so on and so forth. So I would advise everyone to learn about TOGAF and read the TOGAF manual, but as they say, don't implement it. I'll come back to this. So this is really funny. I've taken these are actual references, but I've taken this just from the Wikipedia page for TOGAF, but I find them really, really funny. So research evidence shows that most TOGAF recommendations are usually found inapplicable, and that they are not followed even in the organizations included in the list of TOGAF users provided by the Open Group. Okay. TOGAF can be considered only as a toolkit of random enterprise architect-related recommendations, and using TOGAF can be best explained as studying TOGAF and then doing something else instead. Our initial assumptions about TOGAF were that it would be a sort of methodology that we could follow to produce our enterprise architecture. However, this turned out not to be the case. At the same time, I really would recommend you guys to learn TOGAF and pick the good parts, but not implement it. Yeah.
There is that TOGAF very clearly says that it has to be adapted locally.
Yes. Yes.
Many people skip this point.
Yes. And it's the same thing that in the 90s, I think, maybe still, there was a saying that no IT manager has ever been fired for picking Microsoft. And the same goes for TOGAF, right? So you have an IT management. They want to pick the right tools. They want to pick best practices. And then what do you pick? You pick Prince2 for project management. You pick ETIL for IT operations. And you pick TOGAF for enterprise architecture. And I say, this is our organization. But this won't work in an agile setting, and you need to adapt it and fit it to your needs. But a lot of the practices here are really, really good. So part of the preliminary scope is actually understanding organizational needs, discussing and putting into context the mandate and how you should use architecture in your organization. Then you should establish an architecture vision, which is like, what's the point of our architecture? What is the problems we're trying to solve? What we're going to do about it? And all of this is really, really good things to do. And then before you dive into concrete technology architecture or information architecture, start looking at the business needs and the business requirements. And this is, in an enterprise setting, exactly the same as design thinking, or start with the real concrete user needs, investigate the user needs before you dive into the solution. So investigate and understand the business needs of the organization that you try to establish architecture governance or cohesive governance in before you dive into the technology. And then TUGAF also states that this is not done like waterfall, one process in turns, but it's done iteratively. You visit and revisit all of these areas in turn and continuously improve and revise your architecture.
TOGAF and Agile, how does that work?
Not very well out of the box, unless you do what I tried to say. Don't implement TUGAF, learn the good parts, implement that in an agile way. And then, since it says multiple times in the TUGAF manual, the first rule of TUGAF is to adapt it to your needs and implement it to your needs. Then you can implement it. You can implement Agile Architecture and then say, this is TUGAF. The same way that you can fulfill a lot of the responsibilities of ETIL in an Agile setting. If you say, yeah, we have documentation or a trail of all the changes in our Jira backlog, or like in the Jira issues and the trails of resolved Jira issues, for example. You can document the requirements for change management and so on by pointing to the Agile practices and strengthening the Agile best practices you already have established, like a definition of done, like good lightweight documentation in Confluence, and by using an issue tracker like Jira or something else, even Trello, right? So the same best practices are valid for TUGAF as well.
I feel a little bit like this type of architecture we talk about here.
Yeah.
Is mainly the C.
Yes.
So inside that C bubble, you can have your agile software architecture. It of course spans into business architecture and technology architecture by all means.
I agree completely. I would say C and D, of course.
But that could be very low level, like Cisco things and all.
Yeah. I agree. Routers and networks and all that stuff. I agree. But I would say Agile Architecture go all the way up to A. Actually, at least understanding and like how does what we are doing on our team fit into the bigger picture? Yeah. And okay, how do we make sure that what we're building on this team fits into the business requirements or actually the end user needs? Then you're in B. So yeah, I think that's it. That's all I had.
I think you have a lot of very useful tips for Agile Architecture, but it seems to me that many of them are aimed for larger organizations. How many of these tips would you say are still applicable for a smaller organization where you have maybe one development team, maybe it's a startup?
Yeah. I would say cut away everything that you don't think you need and introduce them when you need it. But if I jump back and let's say we started with a startup, I would say these steps in some form is really beneficial. Skip bootstrapping an architecture council until you have the people. Having the whole team part of an architecture council it might be a fun thing to do as a social thing. No, but start doing step 1 and step 2. And if I were to start again, I would stress the importance of actually starting documentation and building best practices for this before you feel the urgent need for it. Don't overinvest in it. Don't sit and spend tons of time when everyone have the complete source code in their head. But one day will come pretty fast when you need to scale up to 2 teams, or you go from 6 to 10 engineers, and people will start to lose track on everything that's going on. And already having established this repository of best practices and how stuff works will then become valuable really quick. And then as you go through the growth spurs, when you grow up to 20, 30, and then 50 people in your startup, then you need to establish the architecture council, and the more you have in place with a culture of presenting architecture to each other, doing lightning talks internally. One of the things we tried in the previous company was to have lightning talks together with pizza and Friday beer for everyone in the office, so that the technology teams presented to sales and management and everyone who wanted to listen what we were doing on architecture, and then we invited in product managers and others to talk about product strategy and visions and goals, and to create that positive knowledge sharing in the whole company, not just for technology and architecture. And if engineering can take the lead in that, that is awesome for a technology-driven company. But I think this is very similar to what we're doing in Knowit, by the way. Sharing knowledge and having people from different parts of the organization come and presenting the state of what they're doing. Yep. Thank you.